we're going to be writing our first blueprint program in this lecture so that when we hit play, we get messages printed to the screen. Let's dive in. You can think of programming in Blueprint a little bit like wiring up an electrical circuit. You have your different components and you can wire them up so that when a light switch is switched on, then the light will switch on. Now, because we're going to be introducing a lot of new concepts here, I'm going to be building up a little bit of a glossary as we go. Now, we saw at the end of the last lecture that this thing here is called the event graph. It is the canvas on which we are going to be painting all of our blueprints. And we also saw that we can right-click on the event graph to get a list of functionality. Now, the first thing I want you to search for is print string. And you're going to see that there is a menu item there. It's under the heading development. And if you click it, it brings in something that is called a node. Now, a node is a piece of pre-made functionality that we can drop into our project and use from within Blueprint. And a string is essentially programmer speak for text. So what we've got here is this node, when it's activated, will say hello. We can change this to something else, a message like welcome to warehouse wreckage. Now, we might want this message to be displayed to the screen when we begin playing the game. Now, we can fortunately do this with another node. If we right click, we can look for begin play, and that brings up a menu item called event begin play, and this brings in yet another node. Now, an event is just a special type of when node. It tells us when something should happen. And in this case, the begin play event tells us that something should happen when play begins, when the play button is pressed. Now, you may notice that these nodes have got these little arrows on the left-hand side or right-hand side, sometimes both. These are known as pins, which are essentially sockets that we can connect up to each other. There are input pins, which are on the left, and they tell us when to run this particular node. And there are output pins that tell us what to do after this particular node. So if we have a look at this, we've only got an output pin on the event, which makes sense because we know that events are a when node. They tell us when to do something. And we've got inputs and outputs on the print string, which means that we can tell it when it should start, which is the input, and then we can tell it what to do after, which is the output. So you can click and drag between these pins in either order to make a connection between the two. And connections are literally just these wires between pins that allow us to connect up that when to the what. So in this case, we're connecting up when we begin play, then you should print a string. Let's try this out. If you hit the play button in the toolbar, we should see a welcome to warehouse wreckage string being printed. Now, the message doesn't hang around for very long, but that's okay. We don't need it to. It proves the point. Now, if you notice any background hissing while I'm playing the game, that's not my computer fans or background noise in my room. That's actually some ambient sound that is in our default level that is playing when we hit play. If you hit play on your own project, try it out, and switch on your speakers, you're going to hear the same sound. Now, we can make sequences of nodes in the same way as we could connect multiple light bulbs up together in a sequence, and that would allow us to do one thing and then something else. So I'd like you to take the challenge of printing another message after our first one. So add another print string node by right-clicking and searching for it, connect it up in sequence with our first print string node, and then customize the text to your liking. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So let's exit play with an escape, and then I'm going to show you that you can actually drag off the output pin, and then that brings up automatically a search box for you, so you don't even have to right click, and then I can search for print string, and that adds in a new print string node that is in sequence with the previous one, and I can say get ready to rumble. And what that's going to do is, if we hit play, it prints both of them at the same time. Interestingly, the oldest message goes at the bottom and then the newer one comes afterwards. But that has happened in sequence. We've had one, then the other. There's just no delay between the two because computers are really fast. So make sure that you save your changes. You can save all changed files by doing a Control-Shift-S, and I will see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome. In this lecture we're going to be enabling physics simulation within our scene so that we can get cubes to move around and things to float as if they were in 0G. Let's dive in and see how this works. So this game is going to be one of physics interaction with objects bumping into each other and creating mess and chaos. Let's have a look at how we can do this sort of thing in Unreal. Let's go over to the Minimal Default Level Editor tab. And what we're going to do is, by default, none of these objects will actually be affected by physical laws. So if I take this chair select it and bring it up in the air, and then I go ahead and hit play, it just hangs there as if gravity was not a thing. The reason for this is that it is expensive for your CPU to simulate physics. So if it doesn't have to, Unreal will not do it for any object in the scene. So we need to go ahead and enable it explicitly. So make sure that the chair is still selected, and then let's drag out the details pane so we can see this a little bit better. Now, at the top of the details pane is a list of things called components. We don't have to worry about this too much. Just make sure the topmost item is selected. And then below the search bar, you can see that there are properties. And below the search bar, there's actually a list of filters. There's general, actor, LOD, MISC, and physics. I'd like to select physics. So we're seeing only the actor's properties relating to physics. And you'll see that there is a checkbox here labeled Simulate Physics, and it's currently set to false. If you check that box and hit play, then we get the chair dropping and simulating physics. Wow. Now we can also do this with objects that we add in. So I could go to the quickly add button in the toolbar, go to shapes and cube, and drag a cube in just under the chair. And in fact, I'm going to bring this above the chair and select simulate physics for that cube. If I hit play, then you can see the cube lands on top of the chair and they interact with each other as well as interacting with other objects in the scene. Now, there are a couple of other physical properties worth noting here. One of them is the enable gravity checkbox. So if I took this chair and the one with physics enabled and disabled gravity, then hit play, you can see the chair just floats as if there were no gravity, whereas the cube still falls as if it has a normal amount of gravity. And then the other property I just want you to take note of is the mass. This is how much...
Peraí, brother. Segura a periquita aí que você tá falando. Gravity, enable gravity, no. Oh, que doideira. Por que fica mexendo? Ah, mas tá descendo ainda. Ou tô louco? Tá na lua. Bonito, né, de ver. Alto tá o áudio dessa bosta. Quais as novidades, Cláudio?
something weighs, essentially how many kilograms of substance there is there. By default, this is calculated for you, but you can check the checkbox there to give it a mass that you want. So you can make something super heavy or super light. So if I make the chair super heavy, you can see it reacts a lot less to the cube falling onto it, and it moves much more slowly and sluggishly. So I'd like to challenge you to knock the lamp off the table using the physics system. So enable physics for both the lamp and the table for this to work. Place a large object over the table, presumably with gravity enabled, and knock it over. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So I can actually use the cube that I've already got to try and knock this over. I'm going to move the chair so that the cube hopefully lands down onto the table. Then I'm going to select the table and the lamp on it. I can do that with a shift click to select both, and I can change the details of both at the same time. So I can go ahead and enable physics by clicking the simulate physics checkbox and hit play. Let's see if this works. It landed on the table, but it didn't quite knock it over. So I'm going to make that a bit of a heavier cube by selecting the cube and overriding its mass with the checkbox and setting the mass to 1000 as well. Let's hit that. So heavier mass meant that the statue just went flying.
Que da hora.
That's all for this lecture. I will see you in the next one.
Parece que eu fiz a primeira vez que eu tô abrindo o Unreal, mas dessa vez eu vou focar em aprender direito essa merda.
Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to learn about objects and how we can use functionality on objects and their data.
Nenhuma, tô tomando mais, tô bem.
Programs. Let's dive in.
Pelo menos tá bem, né? Isso que importa. Eu tava meio zoado esses dias, por isso que eu não streamei. escutando uma intensa batalha aqui. E chegou geladeira nova, que a nossa geladeira tá congelando tudo. Minha câmera, sei lá, não tá funcionando. Eu tentei, não é. Eu não tá desligado porque eu não quero aparecer, ó. Tá vendo? O sistema não tá detectando que ela tá conectada, eu preciso. Somehow, some way. Anyway. Nossa geladeira tá quebrada. Parece um mês com a geladeira congelando tudo que você colocar dentro. Virou tipo. Basicamente virou um freezer, né? Até tipo ovo. Vou quebrar o ovo. Ah, bolota de gelo. Pra fazer um eggnog já no jeito, já congeladinho.
Ian. So let's start off this lecture by
Agora nós estamos estudando um pouquinho de Unreal, porque eu sempre gostei do Unreal, né? Tá, aquele outro jogo que a gente tava fazendo até. Tava no Unreal, mas muitos anos sem mexer, esqueci tudo. E aí agora eu quero aprender C++ pra... Quero, então... Tem esse curso que eu tinha comprado há uns anos atrás. Eu acabei não fazendo. Bora e ver como é que... Eu te mostrei as coisas do Lily's Voyage. Pads, equipar os itens. Poder spawnar as coisas que quiser. Abrir ele tava meio bugado, né? Que eu mudei de espaçamento do código de tab para espaço que eu prefiro, só que aí bugou tudo. Meio bugado, sabe? Tipo, por que bugou? Não por que bugou, mas eu preciso arrumar, sabe? Porque tá tudo quebrado, porque o espaçamento tá quebrado e o GD Script ele usa o espaçamento que nem Python, sabe? É aquilo, né? Vou abrir aqui a forma que eu converta. Ai, Fê, por quê? É que eu tô... Ah, é porque eu... Peraí. Nada, mano. Não caiu, eu só tava quieto só. Parei um segundo pra pensar. Tá vendo? Tá cheio de bugzinho. Mas isso é tudo por causa dos espaços. Tu vê em todos os caralho de lugar, tá vendo? Ó? Para, bombom, que saco, fica quieta, bicho dos infernos. É, você é chato sim. Tá vendo? Esses passinhos tudo tem que resolver. Pera, velho, pera que meu gato tá me deixando doido. Olha, que é? Quer ficar no sol? Aí tinha que mexer a caminha dela. Gato burro, não mexe a cama sozinho. Problema bom. Ah, problema fácil de resolver, né? Só mexer só. Isso aqui não tá quebrado, tá ligado? Isso aqui tá certo. Só que ele não tá funcionando porque tá com a merda. E aí a classe não compila, e se a classe não compila. Tá vendo? Aí tem que ficar indo um por um. De boa, tá. Tá muito legal. Bem feliz, na verdade, com o jogo. Tipo, a base. Falta só pra eu considerar que tá 100% pronta. Falta só eu fazer a parte dos NPCs. Pronto. Vendor, sabe essas coisas? Ah, desculpa, Vendor e Questline. Eu tô pensando ainda como que eu vou fazer as questline. Se eu vou fazer mais historinha do que quest. Eu acho que eu vou fazer é forçar as quests para ser offline depois de um determinado level e a história só online. Quest de história é online. Quest. Resolvemos 40, 30 problemas. Começamos com 100. A parte online eu ainda tô estudando. Porque se eu quiser ter clã, né, preciso ter online, né? Eu preciso fazer ter tudo online. Mas eu acho que é uma coisa legal. Tava pensando em fazer uma versão do jogo extra, offline. Quem não quiser nada do online, né? O achievement, essas coisas. Poder jogar offline, né? Mas a ideia inicial é sim de ter clã. Judas. Pensando como que eu quero. Oh, oh. Acho que é legal você ter um joguinho pra jogar, tipo, tá sem internet, sabe? Um joguinho que é de boa, relaxante, mas não é estúpido que nem. Estúpido no sentido de ser super simples, né? Não é alguma coisa. Fazer funcionar. Sentido, né? Acho que é muito mágico você poder jogar um jogo que você gosta em qualquer momento, mesmo que internet. O ruim é essa trend que a gente tá de tudo tem que. Então vai ser mobile PC, vai, mas. Preparei para fazer isso. Basicamente o que eu vou fazer é quando você joga offline, depois você conecta, a gente sincroniza resultados, né? Mas para evitar o galera tendo malandrovski, Eu vou calcular no server de acordo com o tempo que passou, se você realmente poderia chegar onde você chegou, sabe? De evolução. Na real, eu já meio que faço isso já atualmente. Quanto tempo passou? Quantos monstros esse cara com esse dano, sabe, conseguiria matar e tudo mais offline. Eu já faço isso, tá ligado? Pra evitar a gente, sei lá, hackeando de alguma forma o jogo, né? Dá pra prevenir 100%, mas eu tenho que fazer o meu melhor pra as pessoas não ficarem sofrendo com isso, né? Outras pessoas hackeando se vai ter o modo online, né? Mas já resolvemos sem bagulho, velho. Tá bom. Tá bom. Quase lá. Isso já funciona, já fiz isso. Eu detecto se você mudou o tempo no computador, sabe? Pelo menos eu tento, né? Sempre tem uma forma de alguém fazer as merda. Essa é a verdade. Tem que tentar o jogo justo pra não frustrar quem tá jogando certo, né? Quero fazer um esquema de denúncia também, tudo certinho. Onde tipo, o pessoal denunciar e alguma ação for tomada contra a pessoa que foi denunciada, quem denunciou recebeu a notificação, sabe? Deixar bem transparente, falando tipo, o cara que você reportou que era hack ou qualquer merda assim, foi punido, ou não foi, sabe? Eu gosto de transparência. Essa foi fraca, Clouds. Melhore. Você já foi pior que isso, cara. Mas faz tempo, né? Seu nível. Antes. Viu que eu parei de estudar o bagulho que eu tava estudando porque eu queria te mostrar isso aqui, né? Puta merda. Você não tá me ajudando com o meu. Minhas dificuldades de concentração. Fez nada? Fez sim. Você falou que não tinha visto. Como não fez nada? Se tivesse mentido e falado, não, eu já vi. Que arrumando coisas que o René de amanhã podia resolver. Até falei meu nome, tá vendo? Oh fuck. Não que você não saiba, né? Mas enfim. Nossa, mano. É sério? Sério mesmo? Você viu? Ah, tá tentando melhorar. Tô... Parabéns. Foi on. Tá vendo, né? Precisa de... Not all code paths return a value. Ah, tá. Oh. Dá pra você ler os códigos? Tá tamanho bom? Seria péssimo namorado se eu não fosse pro Rio em agosto com minha mina pra ver uma apresentação de artigo científico dela. O bagulho vai ficar uns 2k e meio, é isso, metade do meu salário, mesmo parcelando fica pesado. 2k e meio pra ir pro Rio? Vai de ônibus, porra. Tá? Por que é tão caro? Nossa, tô perdido. File source type. Ué, mas não tem um lugar pra você ficar com ela? Ó. Tenta e conversa. Fala, olha, vamos fazer o seguinte. Me arruma um lugar pra ficar que aí dá, porque senão fica muito caro pra mim, eu não tenho condição, ué. Seja sincero, seja honesto, isso aí. Se você for honesto, fala a verdade pra ela, velho. Ela vai ficar em hotel? Ué. Quem é que gosta? A musiquinha. Mano, acostuma ouvir essa música. Que é essa musiquinha do game. Eu já defini e eu amei essa música do jeito que ficou. Oh shit! Oh! Eita! Vai! Vai! Expected if. Realmente, por que tem um if? Ah tá, porque tá dentro do set. Então, conversa com ela, velho. Que eu falei, faz ela, velho. Por que você não pode ficar com ela no hotel? Mas elas não gostam? Zero julgamento da minha parte, só pra... O que vai quebrar agora? Pra eles ela ainda é virgem. Ah, então você fala, ué. Fala pra ela, ué. Explica, ela é adulta já, né, pô. Ah, quero muito ir, mas eu não tenho condição financeira de ir. É simples assim, fala. Seja honesto. Não acho que ela vai não compreender. Que ela seja uma cuzona, mas aí. Falei isso, mas me sinto mal. Mas por que você se sente mal, velho? E aí. Pode, ué. Não tem então não tem condição, vai fazer. Vai roubar um banco por causa disso? Dar alguém pra ter dinheiro pra. Cara, não ter dinheiro é horrível. Principalmente quando você quer apoiar alguém que você gosta, né? Mas faz parte, mano. Só me sinto um fracasso. Muitas vezes na vida você vai se sentir um fracasso. Não significa que você é um fracasso. Se sente de uma forma que você realmente é. Ai, ai. Sei que é difícil, mas a verdade é essa. Queria eu mesmo ouvir meus sábios conselhos, às vezes. Eu odeio clouds. Eu tá estudando, você fez eu fazer isso. Meu eu de amanhã podia estar fazendo isso e o meu eu de hoje podia estar estudando. Você estragou todos os meus planos, porque agora eu tenho que ir até o final. O que vai dar agora? Nossa, o que aconteceu aqui, velho? Matar esse gato, na moral. Gato chato. Mia pra entrar, Mia pra sair. I'm back, bitches. Ai, ai. Troquei a mesa de lugar. Estamos de volta às origens. Nossa, que chato, ele não aparece o jogo pra vocês verem. Ah. Inventory item icon. Shit. Here we go again. Agora eu posso berrar aqui de novo, posso chorar aqui de novo, que a mulher não tá perto pra ver o vexame. Por que tá dando esse erro, cara? Eu não tô entendendo. Coisa que eu não tô entendendo é por que essa porra dessa ideia não tá abrindo do jeito certo. Olha. Aleluia. Se eu consigo de novo. Realmente. Invalid access to the property or key button index. Aham. That's the... Faltou um tab. Gostou da musiquinha? Aí. Gostou? Sim? Tudo bem que todo mundo vai desligar a música, mas eu achei tão agradável, ficou tão legal. É que tá outra tocando, deixa eu parar. Aqui ó, se liga. Olá, olha como nós está. Com o escudinho. Tudo bem, não tá, né, na versão final, mas é o mesmo que a gente equipou aqui. E se a gente colocar um outro escudo aqui, ó, e a gente vem aqui, ó, e tal, Ctrl clique, ele troca, tá vendo? Pra gente. Troca aqui fora também. É isso. Eu sei que é idiota, mano, mas é muito legal. Quer dizer, não é idiota na verdade, é bem da hora. E agora dá pra fazer level down, level up. E aí ele toca a animação do level up, que eu mudei também, deixei bem mais bonitinha. Ou dá pra setar o level aqui pro level que eu quiser. Fiz umas ferramentas de dev, tá ligado? Pra me ajudar a testar as paradas, né? Vendo? Você pode ver que o level vai diminuindo. Não, tá com uns bugzinhos no tooltip, mas eu não tô muito preocupado com isso agora. Era isso que eu queria mostrar. Os equipamentos sendo equipados. Aí eu arrumei a escada também, não sei se você viu, que antes não tava funcionando. E aí aqui também dá pra eu tipo fazer isso aqui agora, ó. Tum! Spawnar quantos bichos eu quiser. E é legal porque ele lê da minha base, tá ligado? De monstros, então eu posso colocar qualquer monstro em qualquer lugar. O que é bem legal. Ah, eu tô feliz, tô orgulhoso das coisas. Ter conseguido fazer, na verdade, qualquer coisa. Eu nunca mexi com essa engine antes, tá ligado? Foi tudo, né, um pouco de ajuda de ChatGPT e não sei o que, mas foi tudo na mão, né? Então... Olha, tá com outro bug aqui. Não era pra estar aplicando isso a todo momento. Tá vendo que tá com esse efeitinho? Não era pra estar com esse efeitinho toda hora. Era pra estar com efeitinho só quando passa o mouse. Não sei o que aconteceu aqui. Whatever. Depois eu resolvo. Rato infinito. Ah, olha só, could not find node with the group code. Que deu pau lá nos tooltip. Whatever, era isso que eu queria mostrar. Posso voltar pro meu estudo agora? Tô arrombado. Capítulo.
Concept. The concept of objects. It's absolutely vital to a lot of programming languages. So, an object is essentially something that you want to represent, a thing. Something like in a game, you might have an adventurer. He is an object in your world, and he might have some data that represents what he is. Things like his experience points, for example, or maybe his level. He's a level 2 adventurer. Things like that are the data that make up an adventurer.
Você pode estudar junto aí. Você pode ficar ouvindo. Você não vai ver o vídeo, mas você pode estudar ouvindo.
The ability to fire arrows, such as being able to jump, and so on. There are other things that can be objects, though. For example, we can represent things in the real world in the computer, such as the player, and we could store relevant properties to the player. Things like, is the player using a controller? Is the player number 1 or number 2? Those kinds of pieces of data. And the relevant functionalities, such as get their current input. Are they holding down the spacebar, for example? Get the skill level of the player. And then you can have completely abstract objects, things like a list. So you could have a list that has the items 1, 2, 3, 4 in it, or maybe it could have any items that you like in it. The data could change, but it might also have some functionality, such as remove the last item from the list or add to the end of the list. So you can see objects are very, very flexible. They can be used to represent myriad different things. And you'll notice that the functionality at the bottom of these objects is actually what those nodes are, or what a lot of nodes are in Blueprint. So they start to get a little bit of a mapping between the objects and the functionality. Okay, so we've introduced a bunch of new concepts there. Let's just recap slightly. So we've said that objects are collections of data and functionality. What we may have not realized is that actors are actually objects. Actors are objects that can go in a level, and you can see this. If you go into your level, you select the cube, you can see that there's a whole bunch of, in the details pane, a load of data. And as we will see in a bit, there's a load of functionality in the node form in Blueprint as well. Yeah. Components. Now, components we haven't gone into detail before, but here they are. Objects that can go on an actor. Whereas actors go on the level, components go on an actor itself. So
como que tá o volume do bagulho comparando com a música, tá bom?
You will see that the details pane gets a restricted set of details. It shows you not all of the properties that are available on the cube actor, but only the subset of properties that belong to the static mesh component, which is basically the component responsible for telling us how to draw a cube. Now, these objects can often have a lot more data than this, and that means that they can become quite heavy to manipulate by your computer, and certainly if it has to copy these objects around. So instead of doing that, we use a clever structure called a reference, which is essentially just an address, or where do I go to find this object in the computer's memory, so that I don't have to be moving the object around all the time. We'll cover a little bit more about how this actually works in memory when we get to C++, but for now, it's enough to know that it's just an address. So, what we can do, for example, let's dive into Unreal. If we were in our main level and we wanted to use some functionality on our cube, then what I can do is I can select the cube in the scene, and then I can go over to my level blueprint and right-click, and then I can click a Create Reference to Cube, and this creates a new node. Now, what's that doing? Well, that's basically telling us this is the cube's address. If you want to do something with the cube, here's where you find it. What happens in Blueprint when you run the game is it's going to go and find that cube, and then you can ask questions or use functionality on the cube, such as saying, hey, where does your static mesh component live? And if it goes, okay, the static mesh component's over there, so we go and find the static mesh component, and then we can ask questions of that, and it can say, hey, what's your name, static mesh component? And the static mesh component can say, hey, my name's Bob. And so that is how we can use these references and use the functionality of multiple different objects to get to where we want to go. Now, we've said that a reference is where to find an object. And now something else that's worth pointing out is a data pin. What is a data pin? Well, this cube reference actually has one. This little blue round thing on its right-hand side is a data pin. We've actually seen these before on the print string nodes. They're on the left-hand side and they're purple. And how are these different to the other types of pins that we've seen, these white pins? Well, the data pin is the input or output of data for a node. So a node, if it's on the left-hand side, it's the input, it's the data that node can work with. On the right-hand side, it's the data that node produces. So in the case of the cube, this node produces a reference to the cube actor. Then the execution pins. These are actually what those white pins are really called to differentiate them from the data pins, and they are still when to run the node. So data pins are what to run the node with, execution pins are when to run it. So with all that information, let's do a little bit of using the functionality of these objects. So we've got our cube reference. If we drag off of the cube reference pin, you can use all of the functionality that that cube has. As I said, we've got a component on the cube called a static mesh component, and I want to go ahead and get hold of a reference to that. So we'll look for get static mesh component, and the bottommost item for me is get static mesh component. I can click on that. We get a new node with the input being our cube reference and the output being a reference to its static mesh component. So if we drag off of that, then we can ask for the functionality of the static mesh component, such as get display name. And that gets us the input of the static mesh component reference, and it uses its functionality of get display name, and then it returns a string or a text value that we can print using the print string node. So we can drag off of that and type print string, and then we can hook up the execution node so that that runs after the other two print strings at begin play. You'll notice that some of these nodes don't have execution pins. That might be confusing. When do they get run? Well, they get run whenever Blueprint thinks it's appropriate, essentially whenever it's needed by a node that does have an execution pin. So if we go ahead and hit play, you can see that it pops up with a name, cube static mesh component 0, or something like that. It's a bit programmery. It's not Bob. It's a bit more involved than that. But you can see we've essentially coded in that chain of questions that I had on my slide. So I'd like to challenge you to go ahead and get the mass of our static mesh component. We have configured it in the past. If you go into the level and have a look at the details pane, you can see that one of the physics property was the mass, and we've configured that as a piece of data on the static mesh component. Well, if you delete the get display name node and drag off the static mesh component, you should be able to search for get mass, and that should get you the piece of data on the static mesh component. And see if you can print that value using our print string node. Pause the video and have a go.
Yes, we
Okay,
can.
welcome back. So if we go back to the blueprint, just delete our display name, drag off the static mesh component and search for get mass. Then we can pull in that node. We've got a return value here, and that's going to be our mass value. You can see if you hover over it, it says return the mass of this component in kilograms. And by the way, return value just means the output data. And then we can drag that node into our in string for the print string. And you see it creates a little conversion node. That's okay. It's converting from whatever this value is into something that the print string will accept. We can go ahead and hit play, and you see we get the value of 1000, which we know was the mass we configured, or whatever you actually do configure, you can change that and see that this value will change as well. So that's it for this lecture. We've learned about objects and their references and how to use functionality nodes in Blueprint.
Ok, pretty cool. Pô, vou te falar, a galera é muito burra nos comentários do curso, velho. Pelo amor de Deus, mano. As pessoas fazem os cursos sem vontade nenhuma de aprender, de tentar descobrir nada, sabe?
Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be using those functionality nodes to manipulate the object in our scene on request. So if I hit a spacebar, I can make this cube bunny hop up and down. Let's dive in and see how this works. So
Adicionar velocidade no Z.
scene, but what about making them do stuff? Well, what I would like to do is use our physics system here to add a force to our cube and make it jump up in the air. It'll be the first thing that we do with our programming that actually allows it to act in response to something. Now, the way I want to do this is so that it does it in response to actually pressing a key. We've used this begin play event in the past. I want to introduce you to some new events here. What we're going to do is we're going to right-click in the level blueprint, and we're going to search for space bar. And you can see that gives us a keyboard event under the category of keyboard event, space bar. We can click on that, and we're going to bring in a new event node. That's this red one that tells us when something should happen. And you can see it has two execution pins, one for when the spacebar is pressed and one for when the spacebar is released. So let's use this, shall we, to actually print the mass of our cube. So I can do this by selecting all these nodes, and I can shift-click to select more. I can drag them down into place, and I can drag from the pressed execution pin to the input pin of our print string node. And you can see that that's going to actually have two execution pins go into print string, which means that this can be executed either when the spacebar is pressed or when we begin play. So let's go ahead and hit play and see that actually works. So we've got the 1000 that comes up when we begin play, hit spacebar, and 1000 comes up again. What I want to do is for this to actually apply a force upwards. Now, in actual fact, we don't want it to apply a force, but we want to have it apply something called an impulse. Now, the difference between the two in physics parlance is that a force happens over a certain amount of time, whereas an impulse is instantaneous. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete our print string node, and we're going to delete the get mass and the conversion node as well. But we're going to leave the cube and static mesh nodes, so we've got our static mesh reference. If we pull off of this, we're going to look for something that can add an impulse to our cube. Now, notice that when I'm doing this, the search menu here has got context sensitive switched on. And that's quite important because this means it filters down the nodes available to the ones that use the static mesh component object. So if I look for impulse in here, type in impulse, you can see there is an add impulse node here. There's a few of them, but there's an add impulse one. Let's go ahead and get that. You can see it's got execution pins that tell us when we should add the impulse. So we can go ahead and instantly connect this up to the spacebar pressed execution node. So this should mean that the impulse will get added when the spacebar is pressed. So we're doing this, we're adding this impulse to the static mesh component. But there are other properties here on the node that we need to fill out, particularly the value of the impulse itself. Now, this has three parts to it, an X, a Y, and a Z. In fact, when we have these three parts, it's said to be a vector, but we'll get onto vectors in much more detail in a later lecture. Notice this X, Y, and Z actually corresponds to the X, Y, and Z we get on our movement widget on our cube, and also in the bottom left-hand corner of our viewport, you can see there's an X, Y, and Z there, showing us which directions these values basically relate to. So what we can do is we can add in a value. If I wanted it to go up, I would use the Z direction, and we can put in a value into here, such as, I don't know, 100,000 like this. Let's try that out. We go and hit play and hit our space bar. Then at the moment, nothing is happening. And the reason for that is that the value I've entered here is too small. So I'd like you to take the challenge to tweak
Too small
to a value that actually jumps it up into the air. So try multiplying the
É isso que eu ia fazer. Ai. Ah, mas aí ele vai aplicar pra tudo. Make.
Tá pulando. É como pula. Eita porra! Por que isso é divertido e besta ao mesmo tempo? Jump! Jump, motherfucker, jump, 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 jump. Eu sei.
Mass by 100, you may find that that is in the right ballpark and at least gets the cube to move. Then play around with this value to get something that you like the look of and that acts in a way that's enjoyable to you. And what if you would add it to X and Y instead? What different effects do you get there? Pause the video and have a go.
Pause video and have a go.
Okay, welcome back. So, we're going to try this out. I'm saying 1000, and I can actually do the multiplication right from within here using asterisk. Multiplied by 100 should give us the rough ballpark. We play and hit our spacebar. You can see it's doing tiny little bunny hops, not a great deal, and if I hit spacebar repeatedly, it starts to go a little bit higher in the air. So I'm actually going to multiply this whole value again by asterisk 4. So 4 times the value, hit play, and then make it jump in the air, and that's a little bit more of a decent bunny hop that we're getting there. Now, the reason we had to multiply by the mass is because of this formula, that force is actually equal to a mass times an acceleration. So if we want a certain acceleration, we need to multiply it by the mass, and that gives us the force required. There's also a similar equation for an impulse, where actually if what you want is a change in velocity rather than an acceleration, then you essentially multiply that by the mass. So what I was saying is that I wanted to increase the velocity by 400, which in this case is 4 meters per second because Unreal uses centimeters as its main unit. Then 400 multiplied by the mass of the cube gives us the impulse required. However, I don't actually have to do that maths if I don't want to. If my desire is a change in velocity, then you see there's this little checkbox down at the bottom of the node, which is labeled velocity change, or vel change for short. And if I check that, it basically ignores the mass entirely and just applies whatever velocity I want. So I can just type in 400 directly into the Z, and that will apply a velocity of 400 in the upwards direction, 400 centimeters per second. So if I go ahead and play, you can see that the impact is exactly the same. However, now, no matter what mass I set on the cube, it's still going to jump by the same amount. And the final part of the puzzle here is, what if I had put this on the X or the Y instead? So if I cut it out of Z and I put it into Y, and maybe I cancel out Z to 0 entirely, if I hit play and hit the spacebar, then you can see it's shifting it over to the side, over to the left, which is the Y direction. If I'd done it in the X, it would shift it forward, which is the X direction. So I'm just going to put that back so that it's just 400 in the Z direction. We can hit play to make sure that that's the case, and we've got our bunny hopping. So in this lecture, we've seen how we can use nodes to actually do something. We've also looked at vectors and forces and impulses a little bit to understand the physics of those systems. I'll see you in the next lecture.
Java.
I'm back, bitches!
Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to learn how to create classes that allow us to share configuration and functionality between multiple objects in our scene. Let's dive in and see how it works. Now, the real power of programming with objects comes when we start to use classes and instances. Well, what is a class? Well, effectively, it is like a template or a blueprint in the regular sense of that word for objects. So this adventurer here, we call this the adventurer class, and it has some default data and it has some functionality. But we can go and create an instance of this class, such as adventurer number 1, call him Bob, for example, and he has his own copy of that data from the adventurer class. This is the actual object, and the class is something that we make the objects from. You can also then have an Adventurer 2, a second instance of the same class, and they share the functionality. Notice they share all the same functionality, and they can have their own version of the data. So you can see Adventurer 2 has changed his experience points. Now, the benefit of this is twofold. One is that we're sharing all that functionality between these different objects, and second is that any of that data that we haven't changed, such as the experience 500 or level 1, if I changed level 1 to level 2, it would change it across all of the instances of the class as well. So how do we go and actually create something like this in Unreal? Well, the first thing I want to do is bring in something that's going to act as our projectile. So the projectile can be our first object and class that we create. So I'm going to go to the Quickly Add to Project button in the toolbar, go down to Shapes and select Sphere and drag a sphere into my scene. I'm also going to drag it up a little bit, and I'm going to try and scale it, make it a little bit smaller by using the Scale tool. And if I click here in the center on the white bit, I can scale the whole thing uniformly till I've got something that's about the right size for my projectile. Now, what I want to do with this projectile is I want to turn it from just being a single object into being a blueprint class for multiple objects. There's an easy way that we can do this. Over in the Details panel, there is a little Blueprints button. If you click on that, you can see it says converts this actor into a reusable blueprint class that can have script behavior. So we can click on that, and we just want to have this new subclass. We just leave the defaults as it is. The only thing we want to change is the name. Now, what we want to call it is projectile. But there is a bit of a naming convention that we tend to use. It's not obligatory, it doesn't have any kind of functional impact on this project, but it does help us to understand things a little bit better. When we make a blueprint class, we tend to prefix it with BP in capital underscore, and that just allows us to instantly see what objects here are blueprint classes. We can go ahead and click select, which for some reason is effectively create, and what it does, it goes ahead
Animal, okay. Kitty, kitty. Oh, frick. Bullshit. This looks good. Good, good, good. I'm an animal.
script behavior. So we can click on that, and we just want to have this actor into a reusable blueprint class that can have script.
Ah, okay. Ah.
Behavior. So we can click on that, and we just want to have this new subclass. We just leave the defaults as it is. The only thing we want to change is the name. Now, what we want to call it is projectile, but there is a bit of a naming convention that we tend to use. It's not obligatory, it doesn't have any kind of functional impact on this project, but it does help us to understand things a little bit better. When we make a blueprint class, we tend to prefix it with BP in capital underscore, and that just allows us to instantly see what objects here are blueprint classes. we can go ahead and click select, which for some reason is effectively create. And what it does, it goes ahead and opens up a new editor here, the editor for the Blueprint class itself. Now we can, like the other editors, dock this into the main window. And you can see again, we've got a lot of stuff. It's very similar to the level blueprint, but we've got a few other things such as a viewport in here that allows us to preview what this blueprint class would look like when we create an object instance of it. So now we've got this main class, we should be able to bring more instances, more objects of this class into the level. And indeed we can either duplicate the object in the document, or you open up the content drawer, and right at the root of your content folder, if you select content folder on the left-hand pane, we've got a projectile blueprint. So what we can do is we can drag that into our scene, and it will have created a new instance, a new copy of that blueprint. But like I said, these are linked copies. Making a change to a property in the BP projectile editor should change it for all instances.
Yeah, I know how
the
class
difference here is we've got
work.
a details pane
Good to
over
the
on the right.
point.
It's very much the same as the details pane we have in our level editor, with the exception that you have to actually click on the components in the left-hand pane to see their properties. So you may have to click down to static mesh component to see some of the properties we're used to seeing directly at the actual level. So one thing to take note of how to do here is changing the material. So at the moment, this material on the ball is very white. We might want to change this to something else. If you have this static mesh component selected over in the pane on the left, and then go over to the details pane on the right, you can see that there's a section labeled materials.
Materials. Yeah, I already changed
this,
that.
And you can see a list of all the materials we've got in our project. You can select any of these and try them out. So I could try something like this cobblestone material, and you can see it looks a little bit ridiculous.
Steaming.
Cannonball,
What's
so
steaming?
I am going to not use that one. So I'd like to challenge you to turn this projectile into a cannonball. Now the way we're going to do this is first of all enabling physics. You'll have to select the static mesh component to find the physics properties and then enable physics, and choose a material of your liking that suits a cannonball a lot better than the current pebble one that I've selected, and then go back to your scene and have a look at what happens. What have they changed there or have they not? Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So first of all, if I hit play, you'll notice that these two balls just sit there because physics isn't enabled. We're going to want physics enabled, so let's go to our details pane with the static mesh component selected over in the left-hand pane, and we're going to scroll on down to where it has the physics section and checkbox for simulate physics. The other change I want to make here is I want to change the materials section. This is element 0. If you click on the drop down now, I'm going to look for a metallic one, and I think I will go for the chrome metal material. So I get a little chrome ball now. That's great. So it's not as boring looking as it was before.
Yeah.
Necessary, we can go ahead and hit play. And if we zoom out, you can see those balls are rolling around on the floor with physics enabled and with a new
What? Where is the sound? This is the sound of my soul.
material. Not just one of them, but both of them, because they are linked back to this blueprint class and they are instances of it. So this is fantastic. We'll be able to use this for all sorts of things where we need multiple instances of the same class in our game, and prevents us from having to repeat ourselves.
Oh shit. I picked something. People are so stupid.
Repeat ourselves too many times. Great stuff. I'll see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome. In this lecture we're going to be creating actors and objects in our scene while we are playing. So if I hit spacebar, it adds in a ball and it adds the impulse to the new projectile that we have created, allowing us to create much more dynamic scenes and games. Let's dive in and see how this is done. So ideally, these projectiles would not be in the scene when we start, because that's not how projectiles work. You tend to create them when you want to shoot in a game, and that is called spawning. In the same way as you might spawn an NPC in any game that you play, well, we can spawn actors into our level as we're playing as well. So let's go ahead and delete all but one of the projectiles in our scene, and we'll see why in a second. We'll use one of them as a reference to figure out where we want our projectiles to spawn. But we do want to go ahead and go over to our level blueprint. And over here, what we want to do is disconnect the spacebar event from the add impulse, just for now. The way you can do this is by alt-clicking either on the execution of the spacebar event or on the one coming into add impulse, and that just goes ahead and removes the wire between the two. And now what we want to do is, dragging off our pressed event, I want to search for a spawn actor node. There's a node called spawn actor from class, and that's the one we want. You can see that having dragged
Spawn actor from class.
Now there's a couple of properties we want to configure to tell the node how to do its job. First of all, we need to tell it what it should be creating. Which blueprint class should it be creating an instance of? Well, we've got a handy little drop down here, and it's got a search box, so we can search for projectile. And BP projectile is the only one that shows up, so we can select that. So we can see that the spawning is essentially just creating an object while we're playing. Now, what about this node here, the next one down, is spawn transform. What's a transform? Well, a transform is just the combination of the location, rotation, and scale of an object. We use these three things together so much in games that it's just given a name, which is transform. And what we can do is, if we go over to our minimal default level and see the viewports, we can move our BP projectile around, and looking in the details pane, you can see that there's a section called transform, and indeed the properties underneath it are called location, rotation, and scale, and you can see the X, Y, and Z values for each. So we've got this projectile, and quite usefully, it's got 60X and 120Z. I'm just going to make a note of that, because if we go back to the blueprint and right-click on the transform node, we can click the split struct pin. Now, don't worry about what that means exactly just yet. We'll cover that in a later lecture. But what we've got now is this split out the transform into its component parts, such as the location, rotation, and scale. So that just allows us to put the newly created projectile in a certain location. So X is going to be 60, Y is 0, and Z is 120. And that's going to give us the correct location. And we don't need to worry about the rotation and scale. The defaults there should be just fine. So if we go ahead and hit play, and then if I hit spacebar, you can see it creates a second projectile in exactly the location that the first projectile was. And go ahead and create as many of these as I like. Wow! On hitting spacebar. Now the final thing to note is that there is a return value pin as the output to our spawn actor. Now, we've used this term return quite a few times, return pin or return value. It's just the output of a node. It's data or objects that come out as a result of executing that node. So this return value, what is it? Let's hover over it, and you can see it says the BP projectile object reference return value, and underneath it, it says it's the constructed object. So it's the object that we have spawned, essentially, the new projectile. And so we can now get rid of the reference to the cube in our blueprint, because we no longer want to be adding an impulse to the cube, we actually want to be adding it to the projectile that we created instead. So that's going to be your challenge, to hook up the impulse.
Okay. Wait a second. Ah, okay, I did it. Get S. Oink. Add impulse. A doink. Target. We don't is. We can do. Here. Beady. Beady. Bye. Bit. Oh. Then we will do. Cover. File save. Ow. Okay. Did it? 10,000. Oh. Pew 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 pew. Okey-doke. Let me see how.
Because we no longer want to be adding an impulse to the cube, we actually want to be adding it to the projectile that we've created instead. So that's going to be your challenge, to hook up the impulse. I'd like you to hook up, first of all, the execution pins. The correct order should be that add impulse should happen.
Yeah, let me do this the other way just so. X. Yep. All right, just so I learn both ways. Oh, this one is cleaner. More than 10,000! Ding ding ding!
We need to hook up the data pin as well, so that we are getting the static mesh from the newly created projectile. And where should we be adding the impulse to? What is it that we're adding it to from that new projectile? Pause the video.
Teacher, I already have done that.
Okay, welcome back. So, you may have guessed that what we're trying to get the static mesh from is the projectile, as I said, but that then it's that static mesh that we're trying to add the impulse to. So we're creating a new projectile, we're getting its static mesh component, and then we're adding an impulse to it. And now we need to just hook up the execution pins to make sure the add impulse is indeed run after we spawn the actor. So let's see what that looks like. We hit play, and we hit the spacebar. You can see that the newly created projectile that spawns into the level gets a little impulse added to it, and we can increase the value of that impulse if we wanted to make it jump a little bit higher into the air, which is just a little bit more fun, isn't it, when things jump up nice and high. And that's it, basically. We've created the basics of spawning in a projectile. So I will see you in the next lecture.
I'll see you in the next lecture. Not see me.
Hello and welcome. In this lecture we're going to be looking at these little pins and the different colours they come in, and understanding that these are different data types that restrict what we can plug into what. So let's dive right in and have a look at what I mean by a data type. So a fairly workable definition of data type is that it's how it is representing certain pieces of data in binary on your computer's memory. But also, it can just be a way of restricting what can we do with this piece of data. So it's not necessarily always about different representations, and you can think of it as the shape of the data, in the sense that a square peg can't fit in a round hole. So we can't get the wrong type of data into the wrong type of pin. So let's have a look at some examples of data types. There is the integer, which is a classic example. An integer is a whole number, so it has values like 2, 23, minus 14, but not something like 1 point, a decimal point across strings. and they can't go about once you. That's very small. And of data and a vector in situations where we shouldn't. And we can put these together and create an even bigger compound structure, the transform, which is the location, rotation, and scale of an actor in a scene. Very complicated. We've seen actors that are cubes. This is another type of object. We've seen that our BP projectile is a type of object as well, and it is an actor. And we've seen that we've got components on our actors, which are also types of objects, and the static mesh component is an example of one of those. So we've got all of these, and these are just made out of those basic data types deep down. They might be made up of more complicated structures in the interim, but it's all about those basic data types. And so when we go and have a look at a graph like this, we can see instantly by the color that this impulse is a vector, for example, that the location, rotation, and scale here are just 3 floating point numbers. And we can also see that this red velocity change checkbox is a Boolean, it's a yes-no answer. So we're starting to understand that these are the data types that are constraining what we can plug into what. So in summary, what we've seen is that a data type is the shape of our data, that I will see you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be firing off these ball bearings from my current location. So wherever I am, it can be used to shoot at objects in our scene and already start to create a bit of wreckage and carnage. Let's dive in and see how we do this. So let's quickly review the project plan as it currently stands. We have already done our playing with physics and spawning our projectiles into the world. Now, what is coming up next is that we need to be aiming those projectiles and ideally starting them from wherever we're shooting from. So at the moment when we play the game, that little steel ball drops out, jumps up into the air, of course, but it isn't affected by where I am. Ideally, this is a kind of first-person shooting game. We should be firing these projectiles out of wherever
Gonna grab the player position
is doing the looking
or
here?
the camera
Well,
position.
let's try and do a little trick that we can do here. It's called
Right.
ejecting. And the way you do this is by holding F8. If you type F8 and then fly around, you'll see that I've kind of just stepped out of my body. That sphere there, if I select it, so the game is still playing at this point, but I'm allowed...
Play F8. What's happening here? Me. This is the default pawn instance, okay, nothing new. I love this chair just floating around.
to go around and select objects. So what we've got is a object here called a default pawn, P-A-W-N,
Default
which is
pawn.
the same as a pawn that you might use in chess, and that hence that little icon. And what that means is it's the piece, the little piece with which we are playing our game. And it is a representation of, a physical representation of the player in the game world. However, if I go ahead and stop the game, either by hitting escape or by hitting the red button in the toolbar, you'll notice there is no such thing as a pawn in my scene, nor if I search my outliner, there's nothing called pawn. So what's going on there? In actual fact, Unreal is by default spawning that pawn into the scene for us, and it is placing it at the location given by an actor in the scene called player start. So if you look in the outliner for something called player start, you will see that there's this object that looks a little bit like a capsule, and it has got an icon of a controller and a flag. And what happens is that if I can move that to a different location if I want my pawn to start in a different place. I can also rotate it if I want to start in a different rotation. And I can go ahead and hit play and verify that that has indeed changed where I start in the game. Now, why is all of this relevant? It's relevant because the pawn is the thing that we want to get the location of, so that we know where to put our little pinballs. So that's what we need to figure out. So let's go over into our minimal default blueprint, our level blueprint, and see if we can somehow get hold of this pawn. We can't get a reference to it like we got a reference to the cube, because it gets spawned in when we start playing. So let's right-click somewhere in an empty space in the event graph and search for PAWN. And you'll notice that one of the nodes that comes up here is called Get Player Pawn. So if that's not coming up straight away for you, you might need to type Get Player Pawn and then hit enter and bring it in. You'll notice that this is one of those nodes that doesn't have an execution pin, but it does have an input data pin and an output data pin. And now we understand those data pins a little bit better, let's have a look at what that is. The input data pin, if you hover over it, it says it's an integer. Okay, so it's looking for a whole number. And there is a comment underneath it that says the index in the player controller list, starting with the local players and then available remote one. So this is for multiplayer games. Seeing as we're a single player game, the index 0 is actually what we want. Index 0 denoting the first and only player. And then you can see the return value here is blue, so I'm guessing it's an object. If I hover over it, you can see that it is a pawn object reference, so it's a pawn object, which we know is an actor as well. Okay, so now with this pawn object, what could we do with that? Well, we can drag off of that pin, and we can search for, what we were looking for is essentially the location of the player pawn. So we can search for location, and we can see that there is something called a Get Actor Location node. Let's go ahead and select that. And now you can see that the input's been connected up to the target, which is the input to this node, and then there's a new return value, which is yellow. So it's a vector. Perfect. This fits with the location that we want in our BP projectile. So let's have a go at firing these balls from the player location. You're going to, can you plug in that location first of all in the way that I've got it? I've got as a location and it needs to go into the spawn node. Now, and also have a look at changing the impulse so that it travels forward so that we can move around and start shooting at the table and chairs. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So first of all, we're going to drag from the return pin of the Get Actor Location node into the input for the spawn actor, which is the spawn transform location. Let's drag that, and they're compatible, they're the same color, they're both vectors, so we can make that connection. Next up, we said we want to change the impulse direction. At the moment, it's firing straight up. What I want to do instead, I'm going to cut out of the Z, set it to 0, so we've got no upwards force. And instead, we know that if we look in our scene, the forwards direction is actually along the x-axis. But notice the x-axis is actually pointing in the opposite direction. So what we need to do is, if we had just put 1000 in, these projectiles are going to fire off backwards. So what we need to do is put in a negative 1000, and that's going to fire in the opposite direction. So let's go ahead and hit play and see if we can make this happen. So I'm going to hit spacebar, and you can see it's now firing out of my nose at the table and chairs, and I can get a little bit closer to have that impact be a little bit more impactful. I think it's still a little bit weak, so I'm going to multiply this all by 4 and go ahead and hit play. And now we have got ourselves a much more ferocious little pinball that we can fire at objects in our scene and have a little bit of fun with. So the last tweak I want to make is that these balls are a little bit light at the moment. So if we go to our content drawer and double click on the BP projectile, then it will open up the blueprint editor. You'll notice that it's got this restricted view at the moment, so you need to click open full blueprint editor to get back to what we're used to, and then click on the viewport tab to see the preview of our ball bearing. Now I'm going to click on the static mesh component over in components, then go to the details pane and have a look for the mass, which I want to override. At the moment it's a mass of 100 kilos. I think I need to make this a little bit heavier, so I'm going to multiply this by 10 as a starting point. And then we can go ahead and hit play, and now when I shoot things with this ball bearing, they really do react because it is a pretty heavy piece of metal. Great stuff. So this game is actually starting to become a little bit of fun. However, we're not able to fire these ball bearings in any particular direction, only forward, and we're going to fix that in the upcoming lectures. I'll see you there.
That was I was trying to do. Try it. Oh shit, I have to. Physics. Enable. Oh, I can't. Statue. Now.
Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at how we can get the rotation of our camera and apply that to the spawn projectiles. So as I rotate my camera around, you can see the projectiles are being rotated in the same direction. So you'll notice that there is a rotation that we can put into our projectile. Now, this may be the start of helping us rotate the direction of travel of that projectile. We can use some information from the projectile later on to actually set our impulse in the correct direction. However, it's currently really hard to tell which way our projectile is rotated because it's entirely spherical. So let's open up the BP projectile class and go to our static mesh component and go up right to the top where it has the transform scale property. And let's just increase the scale along the X direction. A value of about 2 should do the trick. You can see that it becomes kind of deformed sphere instead.
Two.
And if we go ahead and play and shoot this sphere, you can see that the direction that it's traveling in is pretty much that's the direction of the sphere. And so we can see whether our rotation is having any effect when we spawn it. So let's go over to the level blueprint. And the most logical thing to do would be to say, okay, let's go ahead and get the rotation of the player pawn. So let's drag off the player pawn reference node that comes out of get player pawn, and let's look for rotation. And sure enough, we can use get actor rotation. That seems to match with get actor location. It returns a rotator, so this seems to fit, and we can drag that into our spawn transform rotation pin of the spawn actor node. But if we go ahead and play this and we shoot off in different directions, you will actually notice that basically the projectile is not rotating at all. Now, the reason for this is that if we go in and hit play and then instantly eject, so using F8, and have a look at our pawn, we can have a look at the pawn's rotation in the details pane. So we can click on the pawn, go to the details pane, have a look at the transform rotation property, and you can see that it's rotated 180 degrees about the z-axis, but that's the only rotation we've got there. So what happens if I repossess the pawn, which I can do from the toolbar right at the top? There is a little controller button, or I can hit F8 to jump back into the pawn's shoes. What happens if I rotate 180 degrees round? I would expect my rotation to reflect that. So I hit F8 again, I jump out and select the default pawn, and I have a look at its details pane, but you can see its rotation hasn't updated. And that's because by default, this default pawn in Unreal isn't configured to rotate with the camera rotation. Those are two separate things. For whatever reason, it doesn't particularly matter.
Exactly.
But what is important is that there is something that does.
We
reflect
have
the
to get the
rotation,
camera.
and that is
I
called
knew
the
it.
Control rotation. So you can drag off
Motherfucker.
of the get player pawn node, and you can search for control rotation. Instead, you can see there is a get control rotation node. So I'd like to challenge you to try that node out. Try the control rotation. Replace the get actor rotation node and plug into the spawn node and see whether it has any effect when you play in the game. Do those projectiles point in a different direction? Pause the video and have a go.
Safe. Is the Spawn. The rotation of the controller often. Play.
There once was a ship that put to sea. The name of the ship was the Billy O.T. The winds blew hard, her bow dipped down below me. Bully boys blow. Soon may the wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. She'd not been 2 weeks from shore when down on her a right whale bore. The captain called all hands and swore he'd take that whale in tow.
Okay, welcome back. So let's delete our get active rotation, pull off of the get player pawn node, and search for get control rotation, and bring that node in. And you can see the output is again a rotator. Hopefully this time the value will be correct, however. So let's get that rotator and connect it up to our input for the spawn actor. We can go ahead and hit play. And now, if I change the way I'm looking, you can see that these projectiles are flying off a little bit sideways. Now, they're not traveling in the direction of their rotation. That we're going to sort out in the upcoming lectures, but this is a first step. We now know what that direction should be. I'll see you in the next lecture.
Okay, 1 second. Let me see if I can figure this out. Not care. Alt. Make. Okay, make map mix. Okay. Can do this.
What you think about when you're born into a fire? Let 'em burn it out. Sell 'em to the richest buyer.
Oh, kinda. Okay. So probably I have to do this. For everything. And why one by the other? Let's see what happens. That's not what I want. But I really want. So tell me what you want. What you really. Wanna zig. Wanna be my lava split. Yes. So what I do want is this multiplied by something. No. Break this. This is a vector. Then on the Y. I can do that instead, yes. Thousand. Doesn't make sense to me, to be honest, this way, but we'll try it. Ah, okay. Okay. Control rotation. Yay! I figured it out. Kinda, sort of. Good enough, now we can watch.
Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be trying to understand a little bit more about these vector structs and the mathematics so that by the end of this lecture, you will feel comfortable adding and subtracting vectors as well as multiplying them by floating point values. Let's dive in. So soon we're going to want to start setting our impulse in the correct rotated direction. But before we do that, we need to understand a little bit more about the mathematics that underlies vectors. Now, in this video, I'm going to be giving you a whistle-stop tour of vector mathematics, but if you want some more in-depth explanations, then we have a whole course on maths for game development, which I would highly recommend. Vectors are essentially a mathematical concept, and they're quite simple when you boil it down to what they actually mean. A vector is simply a direction in 3D space, and it is a size, or in mathematical parlance, a magnitude. Now, this is all fine, but when it actually comes to representing this on a computer programmatically, it's even simpler. It's essentially just three floating point numbers, an x, a y, and a z component. And that perfectly represents a three-dimensional vector. So let's have a little look at vectors in two-dimensional space, because here I've got a two-dimensional screen, it's easier for me to show you that. So imagine we have our x and y components, and we start off at the 0, 0 point being here in the top right for this example. And we want to position a character in this two-dimensional space. Well, we can have a position vector that points to the location of the character and has a length that takes you from the 0, 0 point all the way to the character's location. And this can be broken down into its component parts, so you can have an x part and a y part, just like you might expect, and how we were doing in our level in Unreal. Now what we can do is we can apply a movement vector to this position vector, so we can have another vector that has this direction and this magnitude or size, and we can actually add those two together to get us a new position like so. So this would look like this, basically the position plus the move vector, so adding these two vectors together gives us a new position vector like so. And what's actually happening at a mathematical level is that we're simply, to get the new positions x, we are adding together the x position of the original position plus the x of the move, and the same thing with the y. So let's take a little bit more of a look at addition and subtraction with vectors. Essentially what we're saying is if we had a vector a that looks like this and a vector b that looks like this, then adding them together would give us the vector, suppose we say that adding them together gives us a vector c, then vector c is simply the arrow that goes straight to the destination. Essentially, you put these vectors head to tail, like so. It doesn't matter which order you do it in, by the way. You could put b first or a first. You're going to end up with the same location here, vector c, which just points straight to the final destination. It's like it's taking a shortcut. And subtraction is incredibly similar. If you've got vector A and vector B like this, then subtraction just involves taking a negative vector b, which is a vector that points in the opposite direction to the normal vector b, and then you can just go ahead and add them together as you would, which is going to end up looking a little bit like this, where vector c points to this location instead. Let's have a look at vector multiplication now, specifically multiplying a vector by a float. What happens if we take a and we say we want to multiply a by 2 to give us vector b? Well, in this case, it's actually fairly straightforward, because all you've got to do is think about adding together two vector a's. That gives you a vector b that is twice as long. The size is twice the size of a vector a. And in fact, you don't have to be restricted to whole numbers here. Half of a vector a is just going to be half as long. You could have 5.6 of a vector a, which is going to be 5.6 times the length of that vector a, but the direction ultimately doesn't get changed. It will always have the same vector direction. So let me challenge you to a little treasure hunt here. I've defined an A, B, and C vector. I've given you their visual representation with the arrow that is a size and a direction. I've also given you their numerical representations down below. And what I would like you to do is, assuming we have our character here on our XY axis grid, and we get given the cryptic treasure hunt directions given here. We've got A plus 3 times B minus C. That's where you will find the treasure. See if you can figure out where this character's got to move to find the treasure. Pause.
Seven minus. So 7 plus 5 minus C, 4, 3, 4, 5.
Pause the video and have a go. Okay, welcome back. So first of all, A, we add A to it. We don't have to do any multiplication of it. So we can add A and it's going to take us to this location over here. Then we are going to add B, but we're going to add it 3 times because it's multiplied by 3. And then we're going to subtract C. So we're going to go in the negative direction of C, or you can see I'm putting the arrow the other way round. So head to head instead of head to tail. And that effectively is the same thing as going in the opposite direction. And you can see we've ended up at this location here, which actually the resultant vector is this one here. That's the result of adding all those vectors together. So it's new, but its new position, its actual coordinate, because we weren't at 0, 0 when we started, the actual coordinate is 5, 1. X, 5, and 1 on the y-axis. And the total resultant move vector is 10, 3. And you could verify this for yourself by actually adding together and multiplying appropriately the x's and the y's separately.
Yeah, but I did that. That's not the correct result. What I'm doing wrong. Ah, it's minus. With minus, it's plus, motherfucker. Okay, that makes sense, but position itself I didn't understand. Let me try.
That's where you will find the treasure. See if you can figure out where this character's got to move to find the treasure. Pause the video and have a go.
Okay.
Okay, welcome back. So first of all, A, we add A to it. We don't have to do any multiplication of it. So we can add A and it's going to take us to this location over here. Then we are going to add B, but we're going to add it 3 times because it's multiplied by 3. And then we're going to subtract C. So
But why did they move it there? I don't know. Oh, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And minus 1. Ah, okay. Now I understand. And on the Y, we added the B 3 times. Okay.
we're going to go in the negative directional C, or you can see I'm putting the arrow the other way round, so head to head instead of head to tail, and that effectively is the same thing as going in the opposite direction. And you can see we've ended up at this location here, which actually the resultant vector is this one here. That's the result of adding all those vectors together. So it's new, but it's new position.
Yeah, okay.
Coordinate
makes
because we were
sense.
at 0, 0 when we started. The actual coordinate is 5, 1. X 5 and 1 on y-axis. And the total resultant move vector is 10, 3. And you could verify this for yourself by actually adding together and multiplying appropriately the x's and the y's separately, and you just end up getting this movement vector defined here, which is that blue one showing up on the grid. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a primer on adding vectors, subtracting them, and multiplying them. In the next lecture, we will put this to use. I'll see you there. Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be firing off the cannonballs in the forward direction of the camera and the cannonball itself. So if I hit space, you can see that I can actually start to aim this ball at objects and try and hit objects in the distance, which is a lot more fun. Yes, I got that chair. It's a lot more fun than it was previously. Let's dive in and see how to do this. So we're going to be using something called a forward vector, but what is it? So I've just, on the sake of argument on this slide, put in an X and Y directions, just like we would have in the viewport to keep things grounded in that reality. And we can imagine we've got our camera here that is the player's camera, that when we rotate the mouse, it's turning around, and we're spawning it now, our projectile, and the newly spawned projectile is getting the correct rotation from the camera, so you can see this as I've depicted it on the slide. Now the forward vector would be essentially the rotated X direction. So it is basically a vector that points in the forward direction after you have rotated it. So you can see this projectile's been rotated around and its forward direction is over here rather than being off back towards the back of the camera, because of the rotation that we've given it from the player pawn's control rotation. Now we can actually get a right vector as well, which is essentially the y-axis that's been rotated, but we're not going to be using that because all we're interested in is sending the projectile in that forward direction. And what's interesting about the vectors that come back from get forward vector and from get right vector is that they have a length of 1. This can be guaranteed they're always going to have a length of 1. And this is really useful because if we want to apply a certain amount of impulse in this direction, all we need to do is multiply this vector to give us the direction by the value that we want, such as 400 if that's the velocity you want to give it. So enough talk, how do we actually achieve this in Blueprint? So what we need to do is query that newly spawned projectile. We've given it the correct rotation over here before we spawned it, and it's been spawned with the correct rotation. We could see that when we play the game. So we need to get its forward vector. So to do that, we can either pull off of the actor reference itself, so the reference to the BP projectile, which comes out of the spawn actor node, or we could do it from the static mesh component. Either one would work just fine. I'm going to do it from the actor just to save on nodes and keep things a little bit tidier. So what we're going to do here is type in get forward
Pretty cool.
vector, and we can see two options here. I'm going to be using the get actor forward vector, but both would actually give you the same result. And then we've got ourselves the vector value. Now, if we plug this directly into the impulse, we aren't going to see much of an effect.
That's
Go ahead and
different,
hit
eh?
play. and we spawn a projectile, you can see it just drops straight down. And the reason for that is that the length of this vector is going to be 1, which, as we know, because of Unreal units, that's in centimeters, so it's giving us 1 centimeter per second, which is a pretty puny velocity. So what we need to be able to do is multiply this vector by a float. Fortunately, we can do that fairly straightforwardly in Blueprint. We can drag off of the return value for this forward vector, and we can type multiply. And that gives us this multiply operator node. And you see by default what it wants to do is it wants to multiply a vector by a vector, but that's not what we want to achieve. Unfortunately, we can change that by right-clicking on the second input node. We can click convert pin, and we can convert the pin to a float. And that gives us the correct type of multiplication that we want. So I'd like to challenge you to do this multiply vector for yourself. So plug in the multiplication node to both the input and the output to the impulse, and how much do you need to multiply by to get a force that you are happy with? Pause the video and have a go. Hello and welcome back. So we're going to, I've already been using a value of about, I think we said about 400, and by vector, we can type multiply. And that gives us this multiply operator node. And you see by default what it wants to do is it wants to multiply a vector by a vector, but that's not what we want to achieve. Unfortunately, we can change that by right-clicking on the second input node. We can click convert pin, and we can convert the pin to a float. And that gives us the correct type of multiplication that we want. So I'd like to challenge you to do this multiply vector for yourself. So plug in the multiplication node to both the input and the output to the impulse, and how much do you need to multiply by to get a force that you are happy with? Pause the video and have a go. Hello and welcome back. So we're going to, I've already been using a value of about, I think we said about 400, and then I'm going to plug in the output from the multiplication into the input for the impulse. So what we're getting is a vector that is 400 units long and is pointing in the direction, the forward direction of our BP projectile, the way it's rotated, and that is also the same direction as our camera. So let's go ahead and hit play. And when we fire, you can see that it is firing off in the right direction, but with not quite enough force. So I'm going to increase this by make it 1,000. Let's try with 1,000. Okay, we're getting something a lot better now that we can actually start to enjoy. I think we had actually 4,000. I think I'm just misremembering. If we go ahead and play now with 4,000, you can see a projectile that's a lot more fun to fire. And the final thing that I want to do is, because we don't need to know its rotation anymore, and it kind of looks weird that it's this elongated shape, I want to go back into the BP projectile editor, selecting the static mesh component, go into the details pane, and I'm just going to set the scale back to 0.5 like all of the other elements there, which gives us the ball back to being spherical. And if we go ahead and hit play now, we've got a nice little cannonball, which is actually a lot of fun to fire at objects and cause a little bit of destruction. Great stuff. We've achieved a lot in this lecture by applying that get forward vector node. I'll see you in the next one. Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be bringing in some external assets such as these barrels and crates and enabling physics on them so we can have a little bit of fun smashing them to pieces. Let's dive in and see how to get these assets. So currently the least satisfying thing about our game is the assets within it.
Be right back.
Two years ago, I sat down at my PC, opened up Unity, and created a new project. It wasn't the first time I've done this. In fact, I've lost track of how many projects I left unfinished over the last years. But like every time, I was convinced that this time I was actually going to finish it. I had the idea for this project for a while already. Crafting and exploration were always my two favorite parts in games. I never really enjoyed games that make you follow a strict pre-planned path. And after having created countless little endless runners and unfinished mega projects, I wanted to try making my own little crafting and exploration game. I wanted to keep the scope of the game small and simple, which worked great as you can see, since the past teach me how important it is to stay realistic with the project. Nonetheless, I sat down and started planning a bit before getting to work. There were some aspects I wanted to have settled before starting the game's development. The genre was pretty clear from the start. The crafting part was going to be pretty straightforward. You gather resources throughout the world and can process and craft them into new ones, or build structures with them that allow further processing and crafting.
but the exploration was where I suspected things went tricky. You see, normally when it comes to exploration in video games, it's always associated with huge AAA title worlds that are filled to the rim with detail and content. But as a solo developer developing the game in my free time, I don't have the resources for that. I wanted the game to be a pixel art game, but I also wanted the world to have a 3D feel to be more immersive. My first idea was making the game actual 3D and using a pixel art shader when rendering it to the screen. I actually ended up creating a little test prototype for that approach. The problem was that I had absolutely no experience when it came to creating 3D assets, so I would have to spend hundreds of hours of making 3D models before reaching a quality level that I was happy with. But over the last years, I had collected hundreds, if not thousands of hours making pixel art for my other projects. So I decided to go with isometric pixel art. It provided the mix of pixel art style with the 3-dimensional depth that I wanted the game to have, while I didn't have to learn a completely new way of making game assets. So I sat down on my PC and got to work. I started by creating some basic game art so that I had something to work with. Some blocks, a tree, and a basic player sprite. The second step was to create the player and get it moving. I created a tile map, filled it with some basic tiles, and wrote a simple character controller. But WASD felt incredibly weird because of the isometric perspective. I tried a bunch of different key combinations, but nothing felt natural to control. After trying a bit around, I ended up implementing an A-star pathfinding algorithm that made the character move towards the cell that the player clicked on. These were the only controls that didn't feel weird with the isometric art style. Now that the player could move around, I needed to fill the world. I created some trees and stones to place them in the scene. However, the pathfinding algorithm needed a way of knowing which cells could be walked on and which not. For that, I created a second tile map that does not get rendered to the screen, but contains which cells are being occupied by an object. Further, I added a hit and hurt mechanic to make the player able to interact with objects in the scene. And of course, a simple inventory for the materials dropped by the objects. Now that you could run around the world and interact with objects, I thought about how I wanted to shape the world. My initial idea was to separate the world into little islands that the player would have to unlock step by step. I was hoping that separating the world in these chunks would give a small world a much larger feel, since a smaller area had a much higher value compared to a large open world. The progress was going great, until the thing happened that always happens. I got bored and stopped working on the project for months. A couple months passed by when I finally decided to give the project a second try. Around this time, I made my first video about the project. It was my first YouTube video ever, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. The video showed how I implemented lighting and shadows into the game, improving the game's looks significantly in my opinion. While it didn't add too much gameplay value, it felt like a significant step forward, and I finally had fun working on the project again. The video only got about 50 views in the first month, but I was more than happy, and the little but positive feedback was awesome to see. However, not long after, I hit a dead end. The island-based world design did not feel unique or fun. I spent over a month experimenting around. I made the islands adding up as an area, I made them visible one by one, I changed the size and shape, I implemented multiple generation algorithms and different layouts, but nothing worked. There was no huge issue, but it just didn't feel fun to play in my opinion. I eventually decided to pivot to an open world format, which I initially wanted to avoid. I reused the pre-made chunks from the island system to create a simple open world loaded from a Perlin noise function. Nothing fancy, but it did the trick. On top, I had also taken care of some other mechanics like crafting and building system, as well as a provisional UI and some basic sounds, making the game feel a bit more playable. At that point, I decided to give the devlogs another try, and almost one entire year after the first video, I released the second one. I wasn't expecting the video to perform much better than the first one, and for the first 3 days, it didn't. But after 3 days, the video exploded, and my phone kept ringing from people leaving their thoughts on the game in the comments. People wrote what they liked, what they didn't like, and what they wanted to see. And happily, most of the people liked the pivot to the open world. The fact that I could see that people were actually interested in my game was incredible. And at the same time, it also put a little pressure behind the project, which was good for when I really didn't feel like working on it. People started to ask me when and where the game was going to be available. And one viewer pointed out to me that I was missing out on a huge amount of potential wishlists by not having a Steam page for the game yet. He was totally right, so I fixed it right away. Something I've also been asked a lot in the comments is how to get started with game development or what you need to make your own game. My answer has always been that learning how to code is one of, if not the most essential step in bringing your own game ideas to life. I liked how the game was forming, and even though the game was never supposed to be hard, I was starting to miss a little challenge. Not a lot, but there was absolutely no difficulty to the game. Since I wanted it to be a survival game, there had to be a way to die. And what more original way is there than mobs? I implemented a monster class with player targeting and a simple combat system. To spice up the combat, I added a dash, but I'm not sure if I'm going to keep it. The game is not supposed to be a fighting game, so mobs are not that present, but you do encounter some while exploring, adding a tiny bit of danger and difficulty. Also, some monster drops are needed for certain recipes, ensuring that the player can't just always avoid them. As I told you, I was using the old pre-made chunks to generate
Itchy.
but that was starting to become an issue.
Very
After
cute.
playing this, it was really repetitive and homogeneous. To change that, I completely remade the way that the world was generated, by generating each and every aspect of the game's world separately and using some tricks to make the world feel more interesting. At the same time, I added biomes to make the world feel more varied. After the latest video about the topic, I got contacted by Mochikano. She's an artist that has been helping me out by providing some game art and giving me more time to work on the development. She's an awesome artist, so if you want to check her out, I linked her in the description. Having more time for development, I used it to tackle some often requested changes. One of the most common pieces of feedback I received was about the grid and the camera shake. Many people felt the grid was too rigid or distracting, and that the camera shake was uncomfortable. I've since made both of these fully adjustable in the settings, allowing players to customize their experience. The bigger changes that I made include implementing all of the biomes into one singular overworld, adding farming to the game, and replacing the building menu with the overworked inventory which handles all of the building and items now. In general, I've spent the last couple of weeks working through a long list of points, making the game feel more complete. There's still a lot to do, but once that's done, I'm planning on releasing a little demo version on Steam. So this has been the 2-year development of my project. I know that for 2 years, it's not that much to show for, but I am more than happy with it. But first and foremost, this would not be able without you guys. The support for this project has been an incredible motivator.
Pretty cool, mister. Not interest. New feature.
Hi, I'm Mark Roberts, Game Director on Path of Exile. This is the first of a series of videos covering quality of life improvements we're adding to Path of Exile. In the Secrets of the Atlas expansion, you can now pause the game at any time by pressing escape to open the menu or opening any full screen interface, like the passive tree. You'll also be paused if any language
Yay!
is or if you disconnect. It's worth noting that you cannot do this in areas that have the cannot pause debuff, which is usually reserved for pinnacle boss content. Keep an eye on upcoming news leading up to the livestream for Secrets of the Atlas for many more quality of life improvements. Then,
That's
join us
nice.
on June 5th for the livestream, where we'll deep dive into all the content in the expansion. Thanks, and see you then.
Yay. What is Noita? What is this?
Lately, I've been playing a lot of Noita, the most recent release from Nola Games. It combines my favorite genre, roguelikes, with the mechanics of popular Falling Sand games.
Oh wow.
While playing, I realized that I'd never taken the time to dive in and figure out how these types of sand games work. So with that in mind, let's explore the tech behind sand games like Noita, as I discuss how I implemented my version of it.
So cool.
For this, I'm using Gunslinger, which is my open source C99 framework I've been working on for games, tools, and visualizers. It's portable and compiles for Windows, Mac, and Linux, and it comes with a few examples for quickly getting started. I even used it to make all the animations for this video using a really crappy vector renderer I wrote over the course of a few days. There's a GitHub link in the description for anyone interested in checking it out. In my research, I was able to find multiple websites, as well as a GDC talk where one of the devs from Nola Games, Petri, discusses a lot of the algorithms surrounding how a simple sand falling game
Jesus
works, as well as how the
Christ.
data could be structured and processed. First, we need to define a few things. Falling sand simulations are basically a form of complex cellular automata. You can think of most cellular automatas as a type of turn-based game, where you have a world that's comprised of a grid of cells, and where each turn you modify the state of each cell in your grid based on the neighbors that surround that cell. One of the most classically used examples is John Conway's Game of Life. As you can tell, these rules are really simple, but incredibly complex machines and simulations can be built out of just using these rules. Alright, so with that said, let's go back to Noita. Our entire game world is made up of a 2D array of particle data. Each particle is a structure containing all of the information it needs in order to know how to behave in the world, such as its ID, total lifetime, color, and whether or not it's been updated yet for this particular frame. Each frame of our simulation, we iterate through the particle data row by column. For each cell in our grid, we examine its ID type. For empty cells, we ignore them. And for any other IDs, we'll call the update function for that cell's type. So let's take a look at a contrived example. Here we have a single sand block placed somewhere in the grid. When we get to its update loop, the sand will follow this set of rules. If the block below it is empty, we'll move down. Otherwise, if the block below and to the left is empty, we'll move down and to the left. Otherwise, if the block below and to the right is empty, then we'll move there. And if all else fails, we'll just stay put. And with just this, the results are quite interesting already. And the beauty of this is that the rules are really simple, but we can alter them and change certain properties in order to get more refined and realistic configurations, as we'll see later on. I should also mention, as a general rule, all of our particles will be confined to the space of the world and simply won't be able to leave the bounds of it.
Pretty cool.
Water and other liquids initially behave exactly the same as sand, falling down and looking left and right below them for a place to move. However, unlike sand, when these first three rules fail, they will also look to their immediate left and right respectively. This tends to give off the effect of flowing, to simulate the property that water will attempt to fill any void it finds available to it. So again, with these simple rules, we have a decent starting point for sand and water, but we're not done. As I mentioned earlier, these rules can be modified and adapted in order to achieve more realistic results. And up until this point, we haven't actually been taking velocity or any other forces into account. This of course means that all of our particles will fall at a constant speed of 1 cell per frame, and the water will flow, well, just as slowly. Let's add a constant rate of acceleration for gravity to change our velocity, as well as for liquids, a spread factor velocity, which will allow us to spread faster left and right. Yeah, that looks terrible. Here's the issue. Previously, each particle could only ever move 1 cell at a time, so it was only ever interested in its immediate neighbors. When we add velocity or any other forces into the mix, we're now interested in every single particle that our particle could interact with along its way to its final position. So looking at this example of the water, there are moments where the water is unable to spread anywhere because its requested position is unavailable, so it stops completely and causes this repeated jagged effect. So here's my naive solution to fix this. Using the particle's velocity, we'll compute its desired next position for this frame. We'll then travel to every cell along that path. If we run into anything along the way, as is the case here, we'll stop and just leave the particle in the last free spot that we found. Now with that change, our water is able to flow in a much more convincing manner, and our sand particles can fall at a faster rate. Alright, time to add in another particle. Let's do something stationary made out of wood. And this thing's pretty simple to update. It won't be affected by gravity or any other forces. However, whenever the particles start to fall, you start to get some really cool emergent behaviors, especially when you, say, erase parts of the wall.
So cool.
Or when you flood various valleys and areas and watch it spill over into the surrounding floor. I want to jump ahead to fire. It's one of my favorite particles, mainly because of all the dynamic behaviors that just naturally emerge from it. It's destructive, it only lives for a short amount of time, and in its most simple version, the only way it's able to move is by consuming particles next to it that are flammable. This also generates a lot of smoke, as you can see from the footage. Smoke is pretty simple to do. If you think about it, it's really just sand, but inverted. So instead of falling down due to gravity, the smoke will just rise to the top of the world, and then kind of pool up there. So at this point, we've assembled kind of a nice collection of particles. We have sand, water, fire, embers, and smoke. Adding new ones really should become second nature once we have our base rules down. Gunpowder, for instance, works almost exactly the same as sand does. However, it has a very high flammability chance. Salt works exactly the same as sand as well. However, it has a chance to dissolve in water. It's also less dense than water, so you can say that if it's surrounded by water particles, for instance, then it has a chance to rise to the top. Lava is liquid in movement, however, it has a really high chance to catch things on fire. Steam works just like smoke, however, it's a byproduct of whenever fire and water touch. Oil works exactly the same as water in movement, except it's very flammable. And acid works exactly the same in movement as any other liquid, but it's very highly corrosive and will eat through most things. So I think we have our basic implementation down, but as a final polish, let's go ahead and make this feel like an actual tool, where you can select whatever particle you want to paint with on the side. Visually, everything's pretty underwhelming, so let's add in a bit of post-processing, like some bloom, and a little bit of gamma correction. Yeah, that's feeling better, but there's still something not right to me. See, most cellular automatas, you can paint in little states, but typically you start with a starting state, and we're not really doing that here. So here's what I want to do. Let's allow the user to drag and drop images from disk into the program. Then we'll take all the pixel data from that image, and we'll create particles for each one so that we can interact with the scene. Now you'll notice, most images are rich in color. They're typically 32-bit RGBA, and we have a very limited color palette with just our particles. So what we'll have to do is very simply map this rich 32-bit RGBA data down to our small limited palette. And this is easy enough to do. We'll just look at every single pixel, and we'll match that with our palette range, and based on a least Euclidean distance algorithm, we'll select the most appropriate one. Of course, there's going to be artifacts with this, but it's simple enough for this application, and I really think it has a certain sense of charm to it.
Very nice.
So, that's it for the video. I hope you found this interesting.
Very
The source code for
interesting.
This project is available online, open source. I'll have a GitHub link down in the description. I'm also going to put a link to my Discord channel, so if you have any questions about games, graphics, or programming in general, feel free to jump on there and ask me or any one of the other devs that's on there.
Very
And I'm
cool,
kinda
my
treating this
guy.
as a launchpad for a new series, where I'd like to look at mechanics, especially from popular video.
Let me see if you did something else. Or you stopped it 5 years ago. Yeah. Very, very cool.
The legend continues.
All right, listen up, pixel punks and joystick junkies. Not every great game needs to come from a $1 budget and a logo that plays before a Marvel movie. Sometimes it's the tiny studios, the ones running on ramen noodles and pure caffeine that drop the real bombs. The games that hit you right in the feels, make your brain melt, or let you shoot a assault rifle while riding a sheep. So if you're tired of 200-hour AAA slogs filled with upgrade trees thicker than Tolkien's appendices, welcome to BitCrush's 20 indie bangers that slap harder than your first crush's rejection. Let's go. Blasphemous 2. So, Blasphemous 2. Imagine if Dark Souls went to Catholic school and got really, really into Baroque horror. You're a silent, pointy-helmeted penitent who fights screaming saints and bleeding angels with a sword forged from guilt and nightmares. It's stunning and disturbing. The world is brutal. The bosses look like they escaped from a medieval fever dream. And the pixel art? Honestly, it's so beautiful I wanted to frame some of the death animations. They also fixed the worst sins of the first game. Better traversal, tighter levels, less confusing backtracking. Thank the grotesque bleeding baby saint. This is not your average Metroidvania. It's poetic, brutal, and will make you feel guilty for not playing it sooner. Stray. Let me tell you something. I did not expect to cry while playing as a ginger cat in a hoodie-sized cyberpunk dystopia, and yet, here we are. Stray is not just a game. It's an emotional support animal with neon lighting. You start off being a regular alley cat, doing cat stuff, knocking over cups, meowing at robots, slipping through cracks, and suddenly you're solving the existential crisis of an entire underground city populated by the most depressed androids in gaming. I spent more time curled up in little napping spots than actually playing the main quest, and yet somehow this game made me feel more human than most games where you actually play as a human. The movement is fluid, the atmosphere is insane, and let's be real, every time I meowed, a part of me healed. Also, fun fact, you can trip robots on purpose. Game of the year. Outer Wilds. Not to be confused with The Outer Worlds. Outer Wilds is what happens when you combine space exploration with Groundhog Day and philosophical dread. Every 22 minutes the sun explodes, you die, you restart. But instead of rage quitting, you start learning. And that's the whole game. You explore planets that literally change shape in real time. One is getting swallowed by sand from its twin, another has a black hole at its core, and you're on a janky wooden spaceship with duct tape holding it together. No upgrades, no power-ups, just knowledge. It's one of the most satisfying gameplay loops I've ever experienced. The sense of mystery is unmatched. The emotional gut punches? Real. The ending? I sat in silence for 15 minutes after. If you like your games cosmic, cryptic, and crushingly beautiful, Outer Wilds is a masterpiece. Don't spoil it, just go. Disco Elysium. This game didn't just let me play a detective, it made me question if I should be one. In Disco Elysium, you wake up with a hangover so catastrophic it practically has its own zip code. You're a disaster in a wrinkled tie, solving a murder while your inner monologue, which is somehow 24 different voices, argues about everything from philosophy to pants. There's no combat, no fetch quests, just you, your choices, and the city of Revachol, where everyone is either messed up, deeply poetic, or both. I spent an entire hour trying to get a corpse down from a tree, debated communism with my subconscious, and emotionally broke down over a sad karaoke song. This game isn't fun in the usual sense. It's raw, weird, and occasionally so bleak, it loops back into being hilarious. If you want a game that feels like reading a gritty detective novel while drunk and deeply existential, this is it. Death's Door. Imagine this. You're a tiny crow, you wear a tie, and your job is literally to harvest souls like it's casual 9-to-5 corporate bureaucracy. But make it goth. Welcome to Death's Door, where the combat is tighter than your budget after Steam sales, and the bosses are emotionally repressed nightmares. Now, this one hits like Zelda on espresso. You get melee combos, ranged attacks, dodge rolls, and the kind of enemy design that makes you whisper nope under your breath before getting obliterated anyway. But it's not just the combat. The world is layered, strange, funny, and quietly devastating in ways you wouldn't expect. I laughed, I cried, I screamed at a giant frog wizard, and honestly, I'd do it all again. Bonus points for the soundtrack. It makes death feel oddly comforting, which is either amazing design or a cry for help I haven't unpacked yet. The Stanley Parable, Ultra Deluxe. I pressed a button, then another one, then the narrator judged me. Welcome to The Stanley Parable, where the main antagonist is a sassy British voice that gaslights you in 4K. This game isn't a game, it's a psychological maze designed by an office worker having a breakdown in a cubicle. You walk, the game talks, you disobey, the game adapts. There's a broom closet ending, there's a Minecraft bit, there's even an ending where the game breaks itself out of spite. The Ultra Deluxe Edition just takes that mind-bending experience and slathers it with more absurdity. I once spent 15 minutes walking in a circle while the narrator begged me to stop, and I didn't. It's philosophical, hilarious, and occasionally deeply unsettling. It's like a TED Talk and a comedy sketch had a digital baby. Don't try to win this game. You can't. You're not Stanley. You're a concept. And your concept just hit a metaphorical wall. Inside. So Inside. If Limbo was the creepy first date, Inside is the full-blown existential relationship. No HUD, no dialogue, just vibes. Bleak, disturbing, meticulously crafted vibes. You play as a faceless boy with the most haunting walk cycle ever committed to pixels. I swear, every step he takes feels like he's carrying the weight of your childhood trauma. And then the world? It's like Orwell and Lynch teamed up after binge-watching Black Mirror. At one point, I was hiding from floodlights behind floating pig carcasses. Later, I was swimming with, let's call them aquatic friends that make sirens look like spa day buddies. The puzzles are slick, but it's the storytelling through the environment that kicks you in the soul.
Oh,
No exposition, just pure, what the hell is that? energy.
looks cool.
And don't even get me started on the ending. I sat there, mouth open, controller dropped, questioning reality. Inside isn't just a game. It's a quiet scream into the void, and I loved every second of it. Vampire Survivors. You know those by skeletons? There's Kiss 200. He's choose cousin. That's Pal World. This game is what happens when someone says, "What if Pokemon had guns?" Rabbit once saved my life by throwing a Molotov. That sentence alone makes this game worth it. It probably balances 90s nostalgia with real modern finesse. I played as Lilac, a purple dragon thing that moves like she's got caffeine for blood, get a headache, their death wheels, mid-air duel, like nightmares. Pull and pick their teeth with your bones, monster. I swear I got PTSD from the janitor's arms alone. Creeping sense of doom. You run, hide, and hold your breath every 30 seconds. Platforming's a little janky, but that just adds to the panic. It's short, like 5 hours max, but it sticks to your brain like a horror movie you weren't supposed to watch as a kid. Also, don't eat anything in the game. Trust me, you'll thank me later. Return of the Obra Dinn. Okay, this one. Absolute brainbuster, but in the best possible way. Imagine boarding a ghost ship with no crew and only one tool, a magic pocket watch that rewinds time to the moment of someone's death. That's Obra Dinn. It doesn't hold your hand, it doesn't even glance in your general direction. It drops you in and says, "Figure it out, genius." And you do, slowly. It feels like playing 4D chess with a pirate ghost. The game is entirely in monochrome and somehow manages to be more atmospheric than half the AAA games in full 4K HDR. You'll scribble notes like a madman, connect death diagrams like a sleep-deprived insurance adjuster,
This looks
and feel
cool.
like the smartest human alive when you ID a sailor from the back of his neck. If you love games that make you feel like a genius and a lunatic, this is the one. Lies of P.
Lies of P
What
is
if I
not
told
an
you
indie
Pinocchio
game.
turned emo, bulked up on Victorian boss feels like it bad robot I The audio design is immaculate. Every distant groan of metal sounds like it's like a life raft and staring into space wondering if Christian 2.0 had already taken over. It's horror for people who are terrified of their own brain. 1010 mental breakdown. Into the Breach. Tactical nerds assemble. Into the Breach is what happens when Chess and Pacific Rim have a minimalist baby and that baby is obsessed with time travel. You command a squad of mechs trying to save humanity from giant bugs, except here, every move is pure strategy, not luck. There's no dice, no RNG, just perfect information and the soul-crushing realization that every mistake is 100% your fault. But when you don't screw up, it's euphoric. I've stared at a single turn for 15 minutes trying to save a building full of people and still failed. Then I restarted. This game turns pain into a puzzle and loss into a lesson. Each squad plays differently, each mission feels fresh, and the clean pixel art makes it feel like your Game Boy just evolved. It's not for the faint of heart, but if you like precision, punishment, and saving the world one square at a time, Into the Breach will own you. Life is Strange. There's time travel, there's teen angst, there's a storm coming. Animal Crossing and a goat-themed metal album. 1 minute you're slaying heretics in a dungeon with a flaming sword, the next you're assigning your followers Okay, listen, Gorogoa is a game about sliding pictures around in a grid. Sounds boring, right? Wrong. It's a visual puzzle ballet, a hand-drawn brain massage. 1 second you're lining up a fruit bowl, and the next you've unlocked a hidden portal in a church window that drops into a different timeline. It's absurdly elegant. There's no dialogue, no timer, just 4 panels, your curiosity, and a ridiculous amount of aha moments. It's the kind of game where you feel like a wizard just for noticing the shadow of a staircase lines up perfectly when overlaid on a painting. Every interaction feels like you're breaking the rules of reality, gently. Honestly, I didn't even feel like I was playing a game. I felt like I was communing with some ancient logic god who wanted to test if I was worthy. And the answer was, figure out who killed who and why. And somehow it works brilliantly. You're not handed clues, you mine them, scrape them from notes, snoop in bags, spot inconsistencies in teacups, and it makes you feel like a genius. At first I was like, why does this guy have a chicken feather and a torn glove? 20 minutes later I'm screaming, that's how he poisoned the Duke. The art style, lovingly cursed. The UI, brutally unforgiving. But that's part of the charm. By the time I reached every tree shadow, every pattern in the clouds is suspect. I once spent 45 minutes trying to solve what turned out to be a literal bush. A bush. But when it clicks, oh man, it feels like you discovered a secret language written by an alien god of geometry. It's the kind of game where you walk away smarter, or at least side quests in your AAA-fueled life, they're the main story. The unexpected detour that ends up meaning everything. Whether you were sobbing through Life is Strange, rage puzzling in The Witness, petting cult followers in Cult of the Lamb,
Okay.